If you've spent any time on the back roads of upstate New York, the ones that wind up into the Adirondacks, drop down through the Catskills, and thin out along the Finger Lakes, you've almost certainly driven through a place that felt off. Too still, too empty. A road that runs with purpose and then simply quits. A graveyard with no town left around it. There are far more of these than most New Yorkers will ever realize, and the reasons they emptied out are stranger and sadder than you'd guess. These are 15 of them. Number 15, Tahawus in Essex County. We open with a place so far back in the Adirondack wilderness that reaching it today takes genuine determination. Tahawus sits in the upper Hudson River Valley, north of Newcomb, ringed by some of the most remote forest in the state. The name comes from a Mohawk word meaning he splits the sky, which is precisely what Mount Marcy, the highest peak in New York, does when you look up from the valley floor. Iron ore turned up here in 1826, and the McIntyre Iron Works arrived in a hurry, dropping a blast furnace, a forge, and worker housing into the middle of nowhere. At its height, a few hundred people lived out here, hauling iron out of Adirondack rock. And then the iron betrayed them, because the ore was thick with titanium dioxide, and in 1856, not a single person on the planet knew what to do with that. The furnaces cooled, the workers moved on, and the forest came back in without waiting to be invited. A century later, that same titanium would be worth a fortune, but by then, it was far too late for the village and everyone who had built it. The blast furnace stack still stands out in those woods, a lone stone chimney with nothing left around it, and most New Yorkers have never laid eyes on it. Number 14, Adirondack in Essex County. Adirondack, spelled without the K that nearly everyone wants to add, sits just south of Tahawus along that same Upper Works Road. The two were really one broken dream split across two spots on the map, Tahawus, the industrial heart, and Adirondack, the place people actually lived. All the scaffolding a workforce needed to survive an Adirondack winter while running blast furnaces in the wild. When the McIntyre operation went under in the 1850s, Adirondack drained away right alongside it. No second act here, no titanium reprieve a century down the line. It simply stopped being a town. A few structures still stand in various stages of collapse. The McNaughton Cottage has been shored up, and stone walls run off through forest that has taken back everything else. Hikers cut through on their way to Mount Marcy with no idea they are walking over the bones of a community that tried to build something lasting in one of the least forgiving landscapes in the Northeast. Number 13, Millport in Chemung County. Now we come down out of the mountains into the Chemung River Valley, where Millport once sat in the creek bottoms near Elmira. No fire, no flood, no corporate villain to point at. Millport is the kind of vanishing that happens so slowly you nearly miss it. A town that existed because of a mill, and once the mill stopped making sense, the town stopped making sense right behind it. At its modest best in the mid-1800s, Millport had what a working rural community needed: a post office, a grist mill, a few businesses. But bigger regional mills with better rail connections could process grain faster and cheaper, and the local mill had no way to keep up. Without the mill, there were no businesses, and without the businesses, no post office and no reason for the name to stay on a map. Most people over in Elmira, 20 minutes down the road, have never heard of it. That is the saddest kind of forgotten, not drowned under a reservoir, just quietly outcompeted and rubbed off the page. Number 12, Woodhull in Steuben County. Steuben County, out in the western southern tier, is all steep wooded ridges and narrow valleys, the sort of terrain that made farming a punishment and getting a crop to market a test of pure stubbornness. Woodhull sits up in that hill country, founded early in the 19th century by settlers who believed the land would hold them if they worked it hard enough. For a while it did, with a post office, a school, churches, and farm families who knew every neighbor by name. What wore Woodhull down was simple arithmetic. The valleys got the railroads and the ridges did not, and when cheaper land with better access to market sites just a few miles downhill, that math wins every time. The young left for the valley towns, the old stayed until they no longer could, and the school closed once there weren't enough children to fill it. Woodhull Township still exists on paper, but the hamlet is a shadow, a church, a cemetery, a scattering of old buildings. Number 11, Natural Dam in St. Lawrence County. Far north now, up along the Canadian border, where the Adirondacks flatten out toward the St. Lawrence River Valley and the winters ask whether you genuinely meant it about living here. Natural Dam takes its name from one of the truly striking geological features in the state, a place where the Grass River pours over a broad shelf of flat limestone, forming a natural dam that is, depending on the season, either gorgeous or frozen, absolutely solid. Mills gathered around that feature in the 19th century to take the water power on offer. A small community formed, a post office opened, families dug in. But the hamlet never quite thrived and never quite died either. Dwindled is the honest word. The mills shut down as water power slid into obsolescence, and the economic reason for the place quietly receded. What is left is the geological feature itself, still there, still remarkable, still almost entirely unknown outside the locals and the odd geology tourist who found it on a map and made the long drive up. Number 10, Blenheim in Schoharie County. Schoharie County in the northern Catskills is one of the most consistently overlooked corners of upstate New York. Blenheim sits in the Schoharie Creek Valley, and its story runs through water twice, 65 years apart. Old Blenheim had farms and homes and a covered bridge, and not just any covered bridge. The Blenheim Covered Bridge was, for well over a century, the longest single-span covered wooden bridge in the world. Sit with that for a moment. Standing in a valley most people drive straight through without a second glance. In 1946, the Gilboa Dam created the Schoharie Reservoir for New York City's water supply, and the rising water pushed families out and remade what the community even was. Then in 2011, Hurricane Irene drove a wall of water down the Schoharie Creek and tore the covered bridge apart, a bridge that had stood since 1855, gone in a single afternoon. What Blenheim lost was not really the buildings, it was continuity, the thread tying a community to its own past, and the water cut that thread twice in the same place. Number 9, Kaisertown in Montgomery County. Montgomery County sits in the Mohawk Valley, and the Mohawk River was the road that cracked open the interior of the continent. Kaisertown was one of dozens of little communities that grew along its banks during the settlement years of the late 1700s and early 1800s. Stop on that name for a second. Kaisertown was a German immigrant community, one of many the German-speaking settlers who filled the Mohawk Valley, named the way people do when they are a long way from home and holding tight to something familiar. But the canal era, and then the railroad era after it, both ran their routes through the larger valley towns, and with no economic connection, there was nothing left to anchor Kaisertown in place. Families drifted off, the congregation thinned, the school closed. Today, the name barely surfaces on a map. A cemetery survives, German families set in stone in a spot most Montgomery County residents couldn't find without directions. Number 8, Taborton in Rensselaer County. Rensselaer County sits just east of Albany, which means Taborton stands practically in the shadow of the state capital and still managed to vanish so completely that people in Albany have never heard the name. Taborton is up on the Rensselaer Plateau, rough high ground east of the Hudson, where even sitting close to Albany couldn't rescue a community that had lost its reason to exist. Farming and a little small industry built it, and it had a post office, families, the particular social weave of an upland place that made its own fun. What pulled it apart was straightforward. Albany and Troy were handing out factory wages, and working rocky hillside soil began to look like a bad bargain by comparison. The young left, the farms went fallow, the post office closed. What is left is second-growth forest and stone walls threading through the trees, miles of them, built by hands that cleared those fields and have long since been buried. Number 7. Lumberland in Sullivan County. Sullivan County is famous for the Borscht Belt resort era that crested in the mid-20th century and has been collapsing in slow motion ever since. But before the resorts, before the highways, there were places like Lumberland that lived and died by an entirely different set of forces. Lumberland sits in the southwestern corner of the county near the Delaware River, and its story is bound up with the lumber industry that stripped the Catskill forests through the 19th century. Tanneries cooked hemlock bark for leather. Sawmills turned Catskill timber into the lumber that built New York City. When the hemlock was gone, pulled off those hillsides over decades, the tanneries had nothing left to process, and the sawmills nothing left to cut. And the workers, with no wages, had no reason to stay. Floods on the Delaware eventually dealt with much of what remained. Lumberland Township is still on the books, but the hamlet is gone. The forest that was cut to the ground in the 1800s has grown back thick and full, covering over everything that was done there and everything lost when the doing was finished. Number 6. Phoenicia Junction in Ulster County. Phoenicia Junction is a name that even people who know and love the Catskills will often stare at without a flicker of recognition, and that is exactly why it earns the number 6 slot. Nearly everybody knows Phoenicia, the little hamlet on Route 28 that has remade itself into a destination for Brooklyn weekenders chasing fly fishing and good coffee. I say that with zero judgment. I have been that person on Route 28 hunting for good coffee. But Phoenicia Junction was a wholly separate place. It was the railroad junction where the Ulster and Delaware Railroad met the Stony Clove and Catskill Mountain Branch, and at the peak of the Catskill resort era, it was genuinely busy. Tourists stepping off trains, freight rolling through, a place with its own identity and a small community to support it. Once the automobile made the mountain railroads pointless, the junction lost its whole reason for being. The tracks came up, and the community dissolved back into the land around it. What is left is a ghost of a ghost. Phoenicia survived and reinvented itself. Phoenicia Junction disappeared so thoroughly that even the name has nearly slipped out of local memory. Number 5. Havana in Schuyler County. Here is something that will quietly rearrange your mental map of upstate New York. There is a town in Schuyler County, in the Finger Lakes, called Montour Falls. It sits at the southern tip of Seneca Lake, a perfectly pleasant little place with a waterfall that drops straight down the main street, and it is worth the trip. That town used to be called Havana, not for any connection to Cuba, but named in 1829 by a settler who apparently held firm opinions about naming things. For decades, it was simply Havana, New York, a real town, a county seat for a stretch, a Finger Lakes community with all the usual machinery of 19th century upstate life. Then in 1865, the name was changed to Montour Falls, after the waterfall that defines the place, and Havana, New York, simply stopped existing as a name on the map, which makes it a different species of ghost town from anything else on this list. The buildings are still there, the people are still there, the waterfall is still there, still spectacular. But the town itself, the Havana that lived for 36 years, is gone in about the most complete way a town can go, not physically, just erased out of the name. Number 4. Sageville in Delaware County. Delaware County in the western Catskills is home to one of the most thoroughly water-erased landscapes in the entire state. The Papacton Reservoir, finished in 1955 as part of New York City's water system, flooded the East Branch of the Delaware River Valley and swallowed several communities whole, and Sageville was one of them. Before the reservoir, that valley was farmland and small settlements. Families had been in those hollows for generations, and they had built churches and schools and homes and cemeteries on the reasonable assumption that the valley would still be there when their grandchildren needed it. But New York City needed water, and the city, 3 hours away, had no particular relationship with the people whose farms and family graves were about to go under. The eminent domain proceedings ground forward. Families took compensation many considered deeply unfair and carried out what they could. Sageville went under in 1955, and it has stayed under ever since. The Papacton is the largest reservoir held entirely within New York State, the water genuinely stunning against the Catskill ridgelines on a clear day. But in dry years, when the level drops, foundations rise back up at the water's edge, fence posts, the stone walls of barns, the ghost of Sageville surfacing for a moment before the water climbs again and covers it back over. The dead town breathing. Number 3, Sodom in Saratoga County. Yes, that is the actual name, Sodom, New York, in Saratoga County. And before you ask, nobody seems entirely sure how it got there. The leading guess is that early settlers, in the fire and brimstone tradition of certain New England towns, named their hamlets after biblical places as a kind of warning. There is also a Gomorrah, New York, over in Tioga County. I promise I'm not making that up. Sodom sits in the hill country of Saratoga County, a long way in spirit from the racetrack and the mineral springs that made Saratoga Springs one of the great resort destinations of 19th century America. At its modest peak, Sodom had a post office, a school, farm families, the usual shape of a small upland hamlet. Nothing remarkable about it except the name, which has managed to outlast nearly everything else. What finished it was the story we keep meeting: thin farmland and better prospects elsewhere, the slow leak of the young and then the old. The post office closed, the buildings came down or fell down, and the name held on, attached now to a road and a general area instead of any working community. Sodom still turns up on detailed maps. The hamlet is gone. The name is all that is left, hanging over an empty hillside like the punchline to a joke that stopped being funny about 150 years ago. Number 2, Tunnel in Broome County. Broome County, which most people know as the home of Binghamton, holds up in its rural northern reaches one of the more wonderfully named and utterly forgotten hamlets in the state. Tunnel, New York, named for the Delaware and Hudson Canal Tunnel, bored through the hillside here in the 1840s. Part of the enormous project that carried anthracite coal from Pennsylvania's Wyoming Valley north to the Hudson and on to the fuel-hungry furnaces of New York City. At its working peak, the hamlet around the tunnel was a real operation. Canal workers and the businesses that served them. All the machinery a major 19th century engineering job dragged into being along its path. The tunnel itself was a legitimate feat for its day, cut through solid rock by hand under conditions that would not survive a single modern safety inspection. When the Delaware and Hudson Canal was abandoned in 1898, beaten by the railroads that had made it obsolete, the economic reason for tunnel evaporated along with the canal traffic. The hamlet dwindled. The tunnel is still there, sealed now, a dark bore through a Broome County hillside that most locals have no idea exists. The hamlet is a name on a road sign and almost nothing else. But somewhere in that hill is a hole that men cut by hand with tools from the 1840s, and it has been sitting in the dark for more than 170 years, waiting for someone to remember why they dug it. Number 1, the Tahawus Ironworks and the mountain that splits the sky in Essex County. I know what you're thinking. You already did Tahawus back at number 15. Here's the thing. I gave you the surface version at 15 because the full story deserves a space of its own. And what happened in this valley between 1840 and 1963 is one of the most layered, strangest, most quintessentially Adirondack stories in the history of the state. When the McIntyre Ironworks failed in 1857, the entire operation, blast furnaces, worker housing, the whole industrial village, was simply left where it stood, and the Adirondack forest set immediately to doing what it always does, which is reclaim anything that stops moving. For close to a century, the ruins sat out in the wilderness, a stone blast furnace eaten by trees, foundations sinking into the forest floor. the ghost of an industrial ambition that had run headlong into both the limits of 19th century metallurgy and the flat indifference of the Adirondack woods. Then, in 1941, the National Lead Company realized that the titanium dioxide in the ore, the very impurity that had rendered the iron worthless in 1857, had become one of the most valuable industrial minerals on Earth. Titanium dioxide was the key ingredient in white paint, paper coating, and plastics. The modern world ran on the stuff. National Lead rebuilt the operation, new housing went up beside the old ruins, and a company town rose in the wilderness all over again, a full century after the first attempt had died. And here is where the story takes a turn nobody scripted. In 1947, a man named Theodore Roosevelt Jr., son of the president, was staying at the nearby Tahawus Club when a message reached him. President Warren Harding had died, and Theodore Roosevelt Sr. was needed in Washington. The automobile sent to fetch him picked its way over roads that barely earned the word, through the wilderness, in the dark, at speed. That midnight drive to the railroad station at North Creek is one of the odder footnotes in presidential history. A future president rushed through the very wilderness that had already swallowed one industrial civilization and was patiently waiting on the next. National Lead's titanium operation wound down through the 1960s as cheaper sources opened elsewhere, and the new company town was abandoned in its turn. The forest went back to its patient work. Today, the site is part of the Adirondack Park, and the original blast furnace stack still stands, the ruins of the 19th century village and the 20th century company town both dissolving back into the mountains around it. Two full attempts to build a permanent industrial civilization in the same valley, two failures, and one mountain that was splitting the sky long before any of them showed up and will still be splitting it long after the last foundation stone has vanished into the moss. That is why it is number one. 15 towns, 15 different ways. Upstate New York buried its own history, underwater, under forest, under a century of silence. And this list barely breaks the surface. Every county up here has its own version of these stories. Towns that burned, towns that flooded, towns that just quietly ran out of reasons. If you know one of them, drop the name in the comments. If enough people ask for the same place, that becomes the next video. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and I'll see you next week.